get into them in a moment. And already this morning we've had a brief Remembrance Day observance, and Friday is Remembrance Day, up and coming. And first and foremost, Remembrance Day is what? It is to be an observance. It's a showing of respect and gratitude to the generation before us and to the people who had served and fought to preserve freedom when our freedom was being threatened. And that great effort, it did a few things. It also banded nations together in relationship, and it brought solidarity to national identity. But first and foremost, Remembrance Day is a recognition and an acknowledgement of all those who had sacrificed their lives and so much for Canadians. And so we remember and we have that moment to say thank you for that. And Canada, I love Canada. I am a proud Canadian. I am. I love our country. I have been across this country from coast to coast. I miss Newfoundland and I miss Nunavut. And I may have been in Northwest Territories. I'm not entirely sure. When I got to work in the oil patch for one season, we did go really far up there. And I think we did go across the line, although there was no welcome to the Northwest Territories signs. But it's an awesome country. And I had the privilege of interning in PEI. We honeymooned in PEI and toured Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and it's awesome. You were there, Marianne, just a little while ago, and the people in the Maritimes are just tremendous people. It was just fantastic. And then there was Quebec, and that was a bit of a different experience. And I really do hope to one day get back that way and spend more time in that province than what we were able to. And then there's the West, where we're part of the West, right? And we're also diverse too in the West. It would seem though that us in the prairies, though, we're kind of, we're like comrades. We kind of get each other. We seem to have a good understanding of who we are and what we're about and so forth. And then you have BC, which is regarded as as the most majestic province in the country, really, and one of the most beautiful places in all of the earth and all of the world. And I mentioned the Northwest Territories, and then there's the Yukon too. And some of you have been to the Yukon. Some of you had family living in the Yukon. And the Yukon is said that if you've toured through it, going through the Yukon and going into Alaska, that the Yukon rivals Alaska in its beauty. Some will even say that the Yukon is actually even more beautiful than what Alaska is. And maybe it's one of those unkept or those best kept secrets or whatever, but it's an awesome country that we live within, and I love our country. And even when traveling outside of our country, I've always wanted to be identified as a Canadian. And I remember one time, the very first missions trip we went on with teenagers, we had spent about a week in the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. And each night we would finish our day off in playing in basketball on this little court that was in this little village. And what we really wanted to do was hoping for that time that we would play a game together and maybe talk and socialize and fellowship and have a good chance to speak to one another. And so we kind of wanted to intermingle. We would pick teams, but they wouldn't have it that way. They wanted it them versus us. That's what they wanted. And the reason being is that to us or to them, we were just another form of Americans to them. And they didn't seem to have a real appreciation for Americans. Well, on the second night, we wanted to identify who we were, and so we drew a map, and it didn't look as nice as this map, but we drew a map in the sand. There was a lot of sand where we were in this little peninsula right here, right? We were about right around, I don't know, somewhere in there. And we drew a map, and we separated the states and separated, Canada, so it, you could maybe make the distinction of North America through what we drew. And we were saying, this is the States, and we're up above here. In fact, we live so far north, and we were living really far north at that point, that a large part of our years is actually spent in snow. And so, we're not, we're Canadians. We are from Canada, not of the USA. And at the conclusion of all of that geography lesson and everything like that, the response was, well, what's the difference? What's really the difference? And now we're almost near offended because we're not Americans, we're Canadians, man, and we're polite and we say sorry for very small reasons and we're not loud and we're Canadian. And yeah, we look alike on the outside, I think, most of us, and Canadians and Americans. There are some real similarities between Canadians and Americans, but we are still different. We are still unique. We have our own unique identity. And an American doesn't want to be confused in being a Canadian, and nor does a Canadian want to be confused in being an American, because we do have our own unique identity. And you know what, as I was thinking through that, I even thought, even within the church, sometimes you kind of see that a little bit too, that some churchgoers really don't like being identified as those who go to a different church or other churchgoers. And now I'm going to pick on us. Now, as I look out in here, and we're not all here. Oh, you're looking at the cartoon. Oh, you know what? You can't even read that, can you? We're just going to do this. There we are. Maybe we need to redefine church. You got First Community Church, Second Community Church, and Third Community Church. But I think sometimes, well, let's look at it this way. I look at our church, and we're a Lutheran church, and some of you come from a real long line of Lutheran background, and some of you have been in different churches before you made it here. And a real staunch Lutheran, maybe it's this. It's like, they're very clear. No, we are not Catholic. We are not Anglican. We are not United or Presbyterian or Baptist or so forth. We're Lutherans, I say. Well, okay, I hear you, but are you Christian? Well, yeah, I'm a Lutheran Christian. And so people who have little church background or know very little of, let's say of Christ Lutheran, to keep picking on us a bit, we want to be able to tell them that we're accepting and that you can come to church as you are, because we believe that Jesus is here. We believe that he's in our midst and that he will be found in this place that we call family, our church family. And there are more churches within, I've been using this phrase to describe Morden lately, the GMA, the Greater Morden area, because we're a city, right? Toronto, Greater Toronto area, Greater Vancouver, Greater Morden area, GMA. But a lot of churches have that same premise. They hold to that as well, and they hope for that too. And a lot of the churches in our community, they do look the same, and they're similar. They're similar in how their services will be carried out and so forth. But there are still some differences too. And we can't just simply take a brush and with one big sweeping motion and say that this is what church is. This is who church are. These are the people of the church, because each church, while different, they have a personality unto themselves. They do. They're unique. And that's good, because that then has the potential to spread a larger net for the sake of Christ, for the sake of the gospel, for spreading the good news of Christ. Now, in the New Testament, when we read of religious leaders, there's two big, large groups that we read of. We read of Pharisees and we read of Sadducees, right? Karen mentioned the Sadducees this morning in the reading. And there were some differences between them too. You can't just take a brush and assume that they're all one and the same. They're all in the same pot together with the same common goal and so forth. They weren't. They weren't that way. There were some real differences. See, Sadducees were aristocrats, whereas Pharisees were more layman type of leaders. And Sadducees, they tended to be more wealthy, of the wealthy upper class persuasion, and they held very powerful positions. And in fact, they held the majority of the 70 seats within the ruling council of their day, which was called the Sanhedrin. And from this group of Sadducees, you would find chief priests and high priests and so forth. And these Sadducees worked very hard. They worked very hard in keeping peace by agreeing with the decisions of Rome. And of course, we know in the New Testament times, Rome was the empire of which Israel fell underneath. And these Sadducees, they seem more concerned with politics than of religion. And because they were so accommodating to Rome and they were of the wealthy class, they didn't really relate very well to the common man. And nor did the common man really hold them in high opinion. The common man related better to those who belonged to the party of the Pharisees. And we know that there was issues there too. And religiously, the Sadducees, they only observed the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called what? Confirmation question. The Pentateuch. 5 Tukes, the Pentateuch. And nothing else from the Old Testament was accepted. The Sadducees wouldn't accept it. They did not believe or adhere to any kind of apocalyptic doctrine or perspectives, be it eschatology or end times things. Nor did they believe in a resurrection. Nor did they believe in angels or in a spiritual realm or world. And this too was very different from the Pharisees, because they held to all those perspectives and different viewpoints. And so there were some real differences between these two religious groups, and undoubtedly at times I'm sure that they would have butted heads. And whether it's debates over religion and theology or politics or morality and ethics. However, they could work together, and they did, because they had one common enemy, didn't they? And that was Jesus. And they could come together, and both groups had tried to trap Jesus in theological or philosophical banter, and with no success. And both groups were very threatened by Jesus, because Jesus poked all kinds of holes into their armor of rigidity and legalism and dogmatism. And the Sadducees, they were really upset, because Jesus had poked holes into their temple practices, and they came at Jesus with that question that Kara had read that they had asked. And it's a question that made sense for them to ask. You can see why they would ask it, because it came from a religious perspective that they held to. There is no resurrection. And they referred to a custom with which they were familiar to, or familiar with. And it was within the context of marriage. And they come to Jesus and, teacher, good teacher, this is what Moses had written for us. And they go through this scenario that just, wow, honestly, if that happens, right? Suppose a man's brother dies and his wife has yet to have children. Now, according to the law, or according to custom, this man must take his brother's wife and raise up offspring for his brother to keep his line going. And are you following me so far? And then they carry on. Now, suppose there were 7 brothers, and suppose the second brother dies, and then the widow would then become the wife of the third brother, and then he dies, and eventually she works her way, finds her way through all 7 brothers. Now in the resurrection, whose wife would she be? She had 7 husbands after all. Well, Jesus handles their questions, I think, in 2 different ways. First, I think he explains that resurrection life is very different from life as we know it here and now. You know, and the Bible describes life, as this resurrection life is where time will be no more and death will be no more, and relationships will not be as they are here and now. We will be united with God in His presence in a way that is much more near than what we experience here and now. It'll be much more whole, much more complete. And to try to explain it all is something that's very difficult to do. What will heaven be like? And even John and even Paul, they had visions of another time and another place, and they couldn't put into words adequately enough to describe life hereafter. But you know what? It's enough for me to know that the Bible teaches and proclaims it, that Jesus taught it and proclaimed it, and that we know that we will be with God without boundary or without restraints as we experience them now. And you know what? That fills me up with hope, and it fills me up with gladness and joy, and it helps build my faith. Oh, there's times where I lose perspective of this and I'm down, but we've got to remind ourselves of the promises of God, and resurrection life is among them. And you know what? Because there are times in our lives where we do shed tears, a lot of tears sometimes, and we have much that worries us. And I'm so glad that God's promises are true, and I'm so glad that God is with us through it all. And the thought of being made, or of being united and made whole, I like that a lot, and I believe it with all of my heart. And the things that are awesome in life right now that we know, oh boy, this is a blessing in life that I cannot miss. It only gets better. It only gets better. And the second thing that I think that Jesus accomplishes in his response to the Sadducees is that he demonstrates that even they fail to understand the first 5 books of the Bible themselves. He mentions Moses, who's standing before the burning bush. Do you remember that story? Moses before the burning bush. This burning bush is a manifestation of the presence of God. And Moses is having a conversation with God. And in that conversation, Moses speaks to God, and he refers to God. He calls God the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And these were the patriarch fathers of the faith, written of within the first 5 books. So those names, these Sadducees would have been familiar with all of these people. And then Jesus makes this concluding remark in his conversation with them. Now he, referring to God, is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living, for all live to him. And with these brief remarks, Jesus debunks the rejection of the resurrection, stating that these 3 live on. And these are hard passages to preach from. They really are, because so often when we speak of eternity and resurrection life, it's hard to put words to it all, and sometimes communicating the things that are really deep in our heart that that means so much to us, that hope that was put there by God himself, sometimes it's hard to put into words what we feel, the hope that we have and what we believe with so deeply. And resurrection is true. Jesus rose from the grave. Jesus rose from the dead, and so too we will also. We sang a song last week, one of those great Reformation hymns, and one of the lines is, "And though mortal life come and go, we will be gathered one day on the day of the Lord." And Paul says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, because there's no doubt the day will come." And yeah, there are a lot of despairing things in our world right now, and we have all, I'm sure, if we all were to put our heads together or just even reflect back over our own lives, we have experienced difficult things. And yet so many that are able to declare that through the rain, life has been good. Life has been good, and God has been faithful. He has blessed us. He's been so good, moving us from despair to hope constantly. And this is true of any issue, any difficulty, great or small. There's a reference to the man of Job. Job was read of this morning too. And who was Job? Well, Job was described as what? He was described as a man of patience. He was also described as a man of really intense pain and suffering. And his story is just, it's really horrible to consider when you stop and think of it, because it was so deep. And his tragedies, they have caused and still cause readers to ask, like, how did he ever do it? How did he ever remain true? How did Job remain faithful? Why did he remain faithful? How is it that he never gave up the faith and not just die in despair? Like, how? Now listen, Job had also asked very hard questions too. He lost his kids. He lost his wealth. He was accused by friends. He was covered in boils. He was in the very pit of despair. And as in Psalm 23, he was in the valley of the shadow of death, wishing for death. And then he's wishing for justice. And his friends and family, they failed him. And worse yet, the God whom he knew and served his whole life seemed to have turned against him. And so where was Job to turn? Very interesting. Where was Job to turn? He's abandoned by friends and family, and he turns to the only source of help that is left for him. And he turns to God, who he has just accused of destroying him, and he says, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the last he shall stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. Clinging to God, whom he also, at the same time, he accuses too. And faith is being worked out here within Job. Holding on to God with one hand and shaking a fist with the other, and yet refusing to let go. What patience and persistence and perseverance we see here, and his priority seems to stay. It is to stay in relationship with his God. And it is precisely that refusal to give up on God that leads to moments of inexplicable hope for him. Even in the midst of his overwhelming despair, his hope is that God will remember him and long for him. And he's certain that his Redeemer lives through it all. And that in the end, he himself will see God. And God did deliver. God did deliver and give the affirmation that Job needed. Not only to find comfort and relief, but also to continue on and to move forward in hope and in faith by looking to tomorrow with eyes that see God more clearly through his horrific experience, and to hear God more easily. And I think this is important because we're told this by Paul, that God chose you. God chose you as the first fruits to be saved through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth. Sanctification, it's a big word, big theological word, and it's used in reference to the Holy Spirit's work in the life of a follower, in the life of a believer in Jesus Christ. And I think it describes life as a journey too, a gradual progression, a refining, whereby through all of our life experience, we are able to see that it is so true that our Redeemer does live and that he's here, and we know that he is with us, and that we have all courage and we have all strength to carry on and to persevere through hardships. but also filled. We are filled with this tenacity and this desire to live out the faith, live it out, that God, the life that God has given to us, and carry out on what matters so much to God. That we love him and that we pursue him, and as he does for us, and we do it with all of our heart, and with all of our soul, with all of our strength, and with all of our mind, and that this love would carry over, and every other good work that would come out of us by living in the love of God, through loving all others just as God has loved us. So life is a journey, isn't it? And thankfully, it's a journey with our Redeemer who lives, now and forevermore, and who is with us, now and forevermore. And so then we can boldly sing together that we belong to him. I am thine, O Lord. And we'll use that as our communion hymn as we move forward in our liturgy and declaring what we believe and what we know. But for now, let's start by singing, I am thine, O Lord, together. So would you stand with me as we'll sing verse 1 and verse 4.